don't have to underline what Julia was saying this morning about how marvellous it is to be here and how much we're enjoying it and how splendid it is to make people, to make real friends, not just acquaintances, but real friends in Australia and New Zealand. And I won't go on at great length about that, or indeed about how splendid this conference is obviously going to be. I think we've all felt that it's got off to a marvellous start today, and that we're going to get great pleasure and great inspiration from it. It's obviously going to be successful. It's obviously going to be contentious. Always nice to have a bit of argument. What good is a conference without a bit of argument? And I suppose I always see myself as a sort of general irritant on these occasions, a non-astrologer who desperately tries to remain as sceptical as possible about as many areas of astrology as possible. And so what I say during the course of the conference, what I say now may well irritate you, so anyone who's of a nervous disposition might like to leave now. What I'm going to do is just talk a little about the changes that we've noticed in the public attitude to astrology during the last, I suppose, 15 or 17 years since we've been starting ambling around the world looking at it, not in New Zealand or Australia certainly, but in Europe and in America. And there has been a very considerable change, I think, in the public attitude to the subject we're also interested in, the attitude to what the astrologer can and can't do, and the extent to which it's a science or perhaps a sort of occult guessing game. And there are some astrologers, after all, who would regard what other astrologers claim to be able to do as a sort of occult guessing game. And as one looks at some area of astrology, one is tempted to wonder. And I think one's got to confront these things. One's got to confront the problems, say, of a disaster on the level of Hiroshima, and to consider whether anyone looking at the charts of all the victims of Hiroshima, supposing they were to be available, could conceivably expect to find in each one, first, anything in common, and second, anything suggesting the kind of dreadful end or dreadful experience that those people were going through. Similarly, I was fascinated by Robert's talk this morning, in which he was looking at his own chart for the moment of a very nasty accident earlier this year, and failing to see in it, anyway, any of the traditional indications of disaster one might expect to see. And listening to him being impolite, I thought slightly desperately trying to find something in the chart somewhere, which might indicate disaster. It struck me that after all, if one was to use every conceivable traditional means of drawing up a chart, tropical, sidereal, every kind of house erection system, cosmobiology, midpoints, it would not be impossible to find a chart to confirm anything happening at any moment in any life. And I think this is the kind of criticism that one's got to face. And it's a mistake not to face it. But having said that, just to get back to the main theme, the explosion of interest in astrology which took place in the 1960s, I suppose particularly in the United States, really occurred, I think, looking back now, as a result of a complete misconception. The conception that astrology had a sort of moral to offer, a moral message. And the millions of people who went around singing The Age of Aquarius from the musical Hair, which was produced in pretty well every known country and every known language, somehow felt, it seems, that astrology offered them an alternative form of life to the one they were living, almost an alternative form of government. And it was almost as though they welcomed the fact that astrology promised to regulate the life of mankind by fitting everyone into 12 little boxes, a sort of fascist state government by the stars. Unfortunately, one result of the astrology boom in the 60s was that the people who took that view tended to begin to rely on astrology as a lot of people might rely on their priests or on their psychiatrists as a sort of prop. And of course what they were leaning on was quite the wrong sort of astrology, as we would recognize, and as I suppose they eventually recognized also when one still comes across sort of aging hippies with very dead flowers sort of hanging out of their hair, who still seem to take this view, and it's rather distressing view. the public attitude of that kind of mistaken enthusiast and other misconceptions about astrology, chiefly the idea, of course, that it begins and ends with the sun signs, succeeded in putting off a lot of scientists and other people who might have been tempted otherwise to begin to take astrology seriously, because it has, by the 60s, begun to be taken seriously by, for instance, the Jungians, the analysts, and so on, but a lot of them were put off by this great explosion of interest in the sun signs. And fortunately, however, the flower people and that sort of mistaken view began, if not completely to vanish, at least greatly to diminish. I think it's one of the most astonishing things, and we're all a bit pessimistic about the extent to which sun sign astrology still appears in the press and so on, but I think there's no doubt whatsoever that the number of people who only know about the sun signs has diminished extraordinarily in the last 5, 7, 10 years. Well, one of the problems, of course, about the scientists, if you'll forgive me mentioning the name, is that they, on the whole, don't know want to know about astrology. On the other hand, astrologers don't want to tell them. So there's a sort of polarization going on. And you'll have heard, I suppose, about the famous incident in 1976 when 186 scientists, together a large number of them Nobel Prize winners, who were at a meeting at an international conference in Europe, signed a public statement saying that astrology was dangerous rubbish and the sooner it was put an end to the better. Well, later it was discovered, of course, that an even greater number than had signed the statement had declined to sign it, including, for instance, Carl Sagan, the well-known American astronomer, who said, hang about a bit, you really can't dismiss an entire subject like that without looking into it. And he said that, for instance, astronomy began in superstition. So, on the other hand, did all science, and refused to sign. This himself was a good point. And in the end, of course, if you looked at the signatories, you found that most of them didn't know anything about astrology other than it divided the whole world into 12 sections. All they knew, really, was about the sun sign aspect. But you see, when some astrologers attempted to persuade their colleagues to collate properly tested statistical material to try and provide the interested scientists with something to go on, something to study seriously, some measure of proof that at least some of the claims of astrology were actually tenable, a great outcry went up, and a lot of astrologers said, no, it's nothing to do with science, we don't have anything to do with that filthy word. How dare you? What we're dealing with is an art. We're not dealing with a science. We shouldn't go down to their level. To enter into an alliance with scientists was seen as a sort of betrayal. So again, you see, you get an enormous polarization. I think there's been a shift again in this attitude. Perhaps, to some extent at least, as a result of the work of the Gauquelins in France, which I imagine, and you'll forgive me if I'm telling everybody what they know already, but you know, I dare say that the Gauquelins are two statisticians and psychologists who got into astrology, or the area of astrology, more or less by mistake. They discovered some statistics of Karl Ernst Kraft, mistakenly described by some people as Hitler's astrologer, which he collated in the 30s, and he thought proved that astrology worked. And the Gauquelins set out to examine this and see whether indeed it did that, as statisticians, and they discovered that it was a lot of nonsense. But on the other hand, they found in some of the things that Kraft had got together a hint that all was in their view not well, and something mysterious, as it were. And this set them off on the trail, which has led now to them feeding an enormous amount of data into computers, and coming up with an enormous body of evidence showing that indeed the positions of the planets seem to affect human characteristics. Some of their evidence does conflict with traditional astrological views, but that may matter or not matter according to your view of the whole subject. Now you see, they're presenting this to science. Enormous problems have arisen. And I suppose the attitude of the great majority of scientists is best illustrated by the scandal which occurred in America a couple of years ago, when two men called George Abel and Paul Kurtz, who were members of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, published an article in that committee's journal, The Skeptical Inquirer. I don't know to what extent it circulates here, but it has quite a wide circulation in the States and in England. And they published an article claiming to have attempted to replicate the Go-class tests and have failed to do so. And this, they said, invalidated them. Well, subsequently, it was shown conclusively that Abel and Kurtz had neglected to conduct their own tests to a reputable scientific standard. And in fact, in a review of a book by Professor Hans Eysenck, Astrology, Science or Superstition, Paul Kurtz, in the words of the author, stooped to the use of arguments that have little to do with science and should not be regarded as acceptable in a scientific context. And it seemed, indeed, to be the case that, as another critic put it, truth was deliberately distorted to save, cost what it may, the interests of anti-astrology. And there were resignations from the committee and a great scandal and correspondence in a lot of learned journals, and the whole thing is still rumbling on. But it is an example of the extent to which some scientists are prepared even to falsify evidence to prove that astrology doesn't work. And in England, meanwhile, a very well-known astronomer actually falsified his birth data when he appeared on a television program about astrology, in which actually Julia took part. And when the fact was revealed on the program, because she happened to know his true birth data, he simply stood up and threatened to walk out unless the whole program was re-recorded. And the BBC, because he was very valuable to them, unfortunately agreed, and so the whole thing was re-recorded. In a more recent radio discussion, the same man dismissed the Go-clans as those eccentric French scientists without ever having bothered to look at their evidence and while declining to discuss it. Another scientist was heard to declare at an international conference that no one could offer him any evidence conceivably that would persuade him that astrology was a tenable theory. Now, what a splendid open-minded attitude for scientists. There is, however, a crack in the fabric, in that sort of great blank wall which science puts up. And some interesting people have widened it. Professor Eysenck, who I mentioned just now, in his book, Astrology, Science or Superstition, he's a very well-known psychiatrist and writer on psychiatry in England. I don't know whether his book, it must have been available over here, I'm sure, and it's in paperback now. But I mean, he came to the conclusion, having studied the Go-class evidence and other evidence, that in fact, if that evidence had been presented in support of any other theory, it would have been instantly accepted by science. It was just the fact that it was presented in the area of astrology that made it suspect. Hearteningly, one can now find scientists declaring an interest in astrology in private. Dishearteningly, they're almost always unwilling to say anything about it in public. And this is true, of course, in other areas. I was interviewing for radio a very distinguished scientist and astronomer, Sir Bernard Lovell, a couple of years ago, and the interview was to be about his life and so on, and we were chatting before the red light went on, and I said, what do you think, incidentally, about astrology? And he said, well, of course, I think it's rubbish. He said, mind you, I used to say that about water divining until I discovered I could do it. And I said, that's fascinating, Sir Bernard. I said, can we talk about that in the programme? And he said, my goodness, no. If my colleagues thought I could find water with a bit of bent stick, they'd think I'd gone out of my mind. And the sad thing about it is that that's true, of course. I mean, I can quite understand. One can take a lofty attitude and say, well, of course, he should come out and say this. On the other hand, I suppose if you're in that position with that reputation, I suppose that certain amount of hesitation is understandable. And we find now, talking to astronomers and talking to scientists in Europe, that often in private you do get a certain amount of interest, but not in public. Very, very rarely in public. And interestingly, if you talk to medical men, for instance, we were doing a tiny television thing in Sydney, and in the green room beforehand met a very distinguished surgeon who specialises in replacing limbs after arthritis. He invented a sort of hand that could be attached to the tendons, which people could use. And we were talking about this beforehand, and far from showing any surprise or horror at Julia being an astrologer or our being there to discuss that, he said, but of course, all surgeons must realise now that life operates as a system of cycles. Many of my colleagues will not operate at the time of the full moon because they believe that blood clots less easily then. And, it could be a fairly foolish man who didn't take this kind of thing into consideration. So as I say, the cracks are widening. The chief difficulty, of course, in the way of a real scientific investigation, if that's what anybody wants, and that's a matter of opinion, is founded on these two apparently irreconcilable positions. On the one hand, that astrology is a pseudo-science and foolish, and on the other side, that it provides a real key to the realities of life, if a key that is inexplicable by any known scientific methods we have at the moment. And the truth, I suppose, must certainly lie between the two stools. It's certainly possible, isn't it, to produce proof that, we would say anyway, that at least some aspects of man's life on Earth are affected by the positions of the planets at the time of birth. It's true, unfortunately, that much of the proof, in inverted commas, produced by some astrologers is easily dismissible by any kind of reputable statistical methodology. And it's also true, I think, that I haven't seen, anyway, any evidence that convinces me, evidence of real quality, that it is consistently possible to foretell the future, even in the simplest way, by astrological means. Though, again, everyone who's been in touch with this subject over a number of years will know that there have been some extraordinarily startling examples of this from time to time, and one can't dismiss it out of hand. But I think one has to admit that no proof, in the sense that scientists would regard that word, has so far been produced. It may not be possible to produce it. It may not be necessary to produce it. Again, it's a matter of your view of it. And I suppose a striking step forward, or as a lot of people would say backward, was the publication in 1977 of recent advances in natal astrology, which I've heard some people call recent retreats from natal astrology, compiled by Geoffrey Dean and Arthur Mather. Again, which I'm sure you all know, and if you don't know, you jolly well ought to, because I don't think that any astrologer can really be said to be in command of his subject or her subject unless they've confronted this book, and I think confrontation is what's needed. It does, as you know, I'm sure, summarise and present the evidence for astrology published between 1900 and 1976, and systematically destroys a lot of it, and quite rightly. I mean, it's very heartening to find a lot of old wives' tales destroyed by that book. I mean, there was for years this story of two astrological twins born in, I think, Cleveland, who were said to have been born at the same time, grown up, married at the same time, husbands with the same Christian name, lived 2 streets apart, had children at the same time, drove the same kind of car. And Dean and Mather simply actually got in touch with Cleveland, got people there to check up, and found the whole story is a pack of lies. And it's been put about and repeated by astrologers, and one does this oneself. I went around for years repeating the story of Evangeline Adams being tried in America for fortune-telling, and of the judge saying to her, after her casting the chart of his son, "You have raised astrology to the position of a science." And it was only a couple of months ago, Geoffrey Dean, a couple of months ago, that Geoffrey Dean actually gave me a transcript of the trial, published in the law books in America, which he'd got, and which showed absolutely that the judge, while he used those words, was in fact quoting Evangeline Adams. He was saying that she had claimed to raise astrology to the level of a science. He wasn't saying that. Now this again is repeated again and again and again in astrological books, and indeed I quoted it, we quoted it in our history of astrology. And that's the way that these, without of course checking, perfectly wrong to do so, but here you see the truth comes out. And if recent advances has done nothing else, it's at least disposed of a lot of that silliness. Now, at the other end of it, I think there is the problem that Dr. Dean is really demanding the kind of proof of astrology which is probably not going to be possible ever to produce. It's rather like asking a psychologist to present proof that psychology works. It doesn't seem to me to be possible in the area of using astrology to interpret the mind and the personality. I don't see how you can produce proof of that sort of thing. So I don't think we need to distress ourselves too much about that. To turn from the sublime to the ridiculous, or almost ridiculous, the field of astrological journalism is really rather a depressing one, I think. There are magazines like Horoscope in America and Prediction in England, you possibly see them both over here, which really cater for a public only slightly more interested in astrology than the people who read the sun signs in the newspapers. And they, incidentally, as you may know, were only started in 1930 by the English astrologer R.H. Naylor, so they haven't been around for a long time. There is, interestingly, a far less childish and simplistic magazine published in, of all unexpected places, you might think, Italy, a magazine called Astra, which has a circulation of 250,000 copies, and it's lively and entertaining on one hand, but very well informed on the other. And its readers know not only their sun sign, but their ascendant. Everyone writing for that magazine can assume that the readers know their ascendant, can assume that they know where the planets are, because the magazine regularly prints tables showing the positions of the planets from, 1900 to present day. Now, it's not at the highest level, but it's not at the lowest level either, and it's by far the best popular astrological magazine of its kind, and it's very surprising that publishers elsewhere haven't taken up that challenge and produced a similar magazine in the English language, I think. And just similarly, it's surprising that America hasn't produced a really reputable astrological magazine either. The magazine, the Journal of the American Federation, is really very simplistic if you see it, full of very simple, over-simple articles often. And the correspondence is on a really sort of childish level. And it's very surprising. I mean, one hopes very much that it'll pull itself up by its bootlaces sometime in the future. The Astrological Journal of the Association in England, I think, is on a much better level. And also there, under the aegis of the association, is published a journal called Correlation, which is, I think, now in its 5th publication and comes out irregularly, but about 3 times a year. And that, I suppose, is the most serious journal of its kind in the world. It's well worth subscribing to if you are minded to look at astrology as at least partially a scientific subject. You see how careful I'm being about calling science. It's not for the amateur. It's edited by Simon Best, who's a psychologist and also a medical journalist, and it's subtitled A Journal of Research into Astrology, and it is just that. It has, for instance, recently it's had articles examining the astrological significations of introversion and extroversion, a catalogue of postgraduate dissertations on astrology, which is useful. It presents useful information of this kind. A thorough critical examination of John H. Nelson's world-famous claims to use astrology and correlate planetary positions and interference with shortwave radio reception. And even more arcane, it had an article recently on planetary influences on metal-ion activity. So you see, it's not exactly, settle down for it for a jolly comic read of an evening, but it's a highly serious journal, and again, one hopes that eventually journals at that level will be produced elsewhere. There's also a very lively correspondence column, incidentally, full of good splenetic argument. That's always a good read. The general public, of course, still knows comparatively little. If you compare it with other ages, if you compare it with the Elizabethan age, the lack of knowledge is startling. Shakespeare has well over 100 specific allusions to astrology in his plays, some of them very technical. And he was writing for the mass audience, wasn't writing for astrologers. If you go to certain of his plays today and you hear a laugh, you know there's another astrologer in, because nobody else would understand the joke. And he wasn't writing for astrologers, he was writing for everybody. And this is one of the indications that in the Elizabethan period, the man in the street knew a great deal more about astrology than the man in the street does today. And that's reflected, of course, by the sun sign columns in the newspapers. But I do think that most of their readers now do read them for fun. I don't think people are as simple-minded as is sometimes supposed. If you, on the whole, talk to people, you find that they say, oh, well, I know that's more fun and there's more to it, which is very heartening. And of course, certainly in England and in Europe, the astrological popular writers who write columns for, say, the women's newspapers have more space and are able to allude to planetary positions, are able to give specific dates when they think particular people might be affected by certain transits and so on. So that's fairly bright. And of course, in a lot of almanacs now published, tables are given at the back showing planetary positions, even certain schemes by which you can find without calculation your rising sign and even ways of discovering your moon sign without having to go through endless calculations to do so. And this is another sign, I think, that the public are ready for a more particular interest. But of course the pot thing does continue, and this is a matter for discussion, whether you think it ought to go on. I think our view would tend to be that it's not going to go away. Goodness knows most of the newspapers have tried to stop publishing their star sign columns, and the row from the readers has forced them to print them again. I think our view would be that while they're there, they might as well be done by somebody who knows something about the business than by the resident sub-editor. In other areas, it is used even more overtly for entertainment. There's a man called Russell Grant in England, for instance, who is an astrologer, and a serious astrologer, but who decided, he's an ex-chorus boy, very extrovert character, and he decided when breakfast television started in America, that this was, in England, that this was a way to make a lot of money. And indeed he must have done so, and he appears on breakfast television, falling over backwards. He appears on breakfast television in strange clothing, and sometimes, on the top of a fun fair, or coming down a slide, or swimming, or doing some other strange act, and reciting your star sign for the day. And he's unashamedly committed to being an entertainer. But on the other hand, you see, a lot of astrologers are very, very much against this. On the other hand, one has watched that program when someone has been in the studio, and of course if an actor or actress is a guest, or someone else, he'll be asked to do that chart and talk to them about it. And if they say, well, somebody says I've been born on the cusp, or what do you mean when you say that Jupiter is in aspect to Saturn, he can actually explain it in simple terms that the viewers can understand. And I think that too, in its way, is valuable. It's very, very gradually, perhaps you may think very slowly and too slowly, broadening the area of general knowledge about astrology. So there seems no doubt, really, that both at the bottom of the scale and at the top, attitudes are changing. This is true of serious discussions, too, on radio and television, certainly at home. I did, I think, about 17 years ago, or even longer, perhaps, the first radio program seriously discussing astrology the BBC ever allowed, because their charter, rather, mirroring the law in England, prohibited anything to do with fortune telling, and this is what they thought astrology was. And by dint of talking at them for a long time, I persuaded them to devote an hour to serious discussion, and Jonathan Miller, he always had to have an antagonist, and Jonathan Miller was put up as the antagonist, which was rather a mistake, because he didn't know anything about it. And we had the Go Clowns on and so on, and it was a serious program which got some interest. This antagonist thing's very irritating. I'm glad to say stopped now, but they always used to produce somebody who thought astrology was a lot of rubbish. Sometimes it was very farcical. Julia did a phone-in one day for the BBC, and they produced a little local vicar who said astrology was awful, a product of the devil. But it turned out that he thought it was sun sign astrology. He'd never heard of any other sort. And of course, the moment she started talking about it, his jaw fell open, and he said about 2 sentences in the whole hour. He then went on to take half the fee, which was extremely irritating. But now you do find serious discussions, and we did, for instance, earlier this year, an hour's program on American television, at really quite a reasonable level of discussion. So things are changing, and I think while the man in the street begins to realize that each person has an individual map, an individual horoscope, particular to them and to no one else, science is beginning to realize that those great minds of our century, led, I suppose, by Jung, who have shown an interest in astrology, may indeed have begun to lead the way towards a rediscovery of an art which has been too long denied by them. And now, with that innate modesty of a sun sign Leo, Julia will tell you how to be an astrologer.
What a nerve he's got, hasn't he? Isn't it horrible? What a leader. Well, I'm often asked, and I'm sure we all have been actually, well, what kind of person do you need to be an astrologer? It must be something special or different. And I always reply, not at all. Anyone can be an astrologer. You can learn, you can get a book, learn how to do it tomorrow. The only real requisite is to be really interested in people. that, of course, is putting aside the sort of scientist person who just goes into it for research, which I mentioned earlier today. But I feel that to be a real astrologer, we need this basic interest in people. We are not a special breed. We're not chosen in any way, and we've certainly got no specific gifts. And quite honestly, I do feel that if we think we have, we've really got to look to our own motivations, because if we are into that kind of scene, then it seems to me it's a kind of ego trip. And simply because we're dealing with people's lives, we are in a very strong and powerful position. And therefore, we must be very much aware of this all the time, and to hold ourselves back and not to abuse that. So anyone, it seems to me, who feels they are special or different or anyway out on a limb, different from the rest of humanity, should think again. It's very important, I think, that we all recognise that we've got a specific niche, a very individual niche, and it's quite good if we can recognise what that is. You see, there's room for all of us, absolutely every one of us, whether we're spiritual or esoteric, or whether we veer to the east or the west, whether we're Everton or Addie, or whether we're just down-to-earth, ordinary common garden astrologers. There's plenty of space, there's plenty of room for all of us. And if we fill in our little piece of the jigsaw, then it seems to me we're doing rather well. It's not easy, actually, when you're studying, especially if you're just coming into it, because there are so many theories, and astrology hits you like a blinding flash. It really does. And we can all think of ourselves when we go back to that beginning. There it is, this wonderful thing that hits us. And it's tremendously exciting. And as we get on, there's this theory comes, and that theory comes, and we want to accept them all because we want to encompass as much as possible. But it seems to me that it's equally important for us to be very ruthless as well, to decide what is right for us, which theory works for our particular style, for our particular area, and we must not be sorry, what's the word? We must not be backward in coming forward in rejecting a theory, because there's absolutely no need for us to go on with something we don't really feel that's right inside for us, because that can start with the house systems or whatever. And also, we mustn't be afraid to reject something that someone we respect holds dear to them. We've just got to work it through for ourselves. I feel it's very important. It also seems to me to be important to say we don't know when we don't know, because sometimes we can be drawn into argument and we can lose our cool, and the whole thing becomes so tremendously emotional that we lose our ground. It's much better to be quiet and calm and say, well, I don't know how this particular area works, I'm working on it, but it seems to me that. And whether your opponent accepts it or not, it's up to them. My approach is a very practical one. I'm a very down-to-earth astrologer. In fact, some of my friends say I'm too down-to-earth. I'm earthbound. But I can't help it. That's the way I am. I see this tiny solar system, which, of course, we all know is millions and millions of miles across. But in point of fact, it's a tiny area of space, a tiny bit of the Milky Way system. And we are part of it. And that's my astrological universe, if you like. I personally can't cope with deep space. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of astrologers in the future who can, and lots of theories who take us out and out and out into the outer bounds of our galaxy, and maybe even further. But that's not my scene. I'm also not entirely won over by some of the bigger theories. For instance, I think the higher harmonics and the harmonic theory is absolutely wonderful. And no way would I decry it. But as yet, there haven't been any real findings published about the interpretation of harmonics. And I think there's still a lot of work got to go on there. We can, of course, interpret the charts as we would use our planetary principles in any kind of general astrology. But after all, we are dealing, when we're dealing with harmonics, we're dealing with different levels, with different wavelengths. And it seems to me that it needs to be much more subtle all round. Now, I'm going to press on by perhaps giving you a few tips. And this is going to be teaching your grandmother to suck eggs for most of you. And I hope those of you who are really experienced, and my seniors will forgive me because the headmistress is here, you see. Anyway, forgive me. But I'm thinking at the moment about counselling. And this is so much a vital part of astrological work in these days. And I can't urge you too strongly to try and get hold of some kind of counselling training. Perhaps it's even better if it's just a basic counselling training, maybe totally detached from your astrological training. Then you can align the two together in your own way. In the UK, quite a few astrologers have taken marriage guidance counselling training, and I think that is offered free, providing you're the right sort of person. The council decides whether you are suitable for it, and that has formed a very good basis, because after all, an awful lot of problems astrologers are coping with are related to relationships. So that seems to me to be a very, very important area. And if you can grab at something like that, so much the better, because it's where so much of astrology lies today. Be a good listener before anything else. I tend to think that if we have a client who is upset or disturbed, it's really quite good for them to just come and talk and talk and talk and unburden before you do any work at all. Because in this way, they're letting it all hang out. You'll feel like a wet rag afterwards, but never mind. They'll go away saying, oh, I feel so much better now. Having done that, you can then start to do your astrological mathematics, get the chart worked out, and you can build on that. Remember, when you're just listening, of course, to someone's troubles, I'm sure you've all had this experience. The great thing is to sort the wheat from the chaff, because you will get someone who's going on about her troubles, and she will tell you all sorts of silly, irrelevant stories. But in point of fact, all those silly, irrelevant stories are saying what the real problem is in a very, very different way. So you've got to get at the nitty-gritty. And of course, by that time, you will have got at the real nitty-gritty, because you will have done your homework, and you will see the real cause of the trouble from the chart. So in that way, of course, we are at a terrific advantage to other counsellors who don't have the chart. Incidentally, I think we're at an advantage in this kind of way to doctors who have to use pure intuition to come to their deductions about how much they should tell a client or not. And haven't we all had the client who says, right, I want the nail on the head, you're to tell me, and you know darn well they don't, you know? And we can tell. We can say, what does this client really want? What do they really want to know? They should know all, but it's up to us to put it in the right way for that individual. And there again, we can do this because we have the individual's birth chart, and because we can relate to it and see what sort of person they really are. I was thinking too about intuition, and it took me back to the day I received my diploma, and it was a lovely sunny summer's day, and I'd been summoned to a very pretty house in North London, and I rang the bell, and a lovely lady astrologer called Ingrid Lynn, who's very famous in England, and the sort of older generation of astrologers, opened the door and she said, "Oh, come in," she said. "Come in and meet the headmistress." Not this headmistress, this was the headmistress in London. "Do come in." So I went and met the headmistress, and we all had tea, and we were diplomas, and it was all very exciting. And as we left, I left with another lady who had also got her diploma. And we walked to the bus stop together. And she said to me, "Oh, isn't it wonderful? Oh, it's so wonderful to be an astrologer," she said. I said, "Yes, it's absolutely fascinating. I think we're both going to have very interesting careers." "Oh, darling," she said, "do you know what I do?" She said, "I get my chart, I get my typewriter, I put some lovely music on the gramophone record player, and she said, I look at my chart and I listen to the music and I drift off." And I thought, oh, what have I let myself in for? Because there's me slogging A plus B equals C, and I've got to bear this in mind, I've got to bear that in mind, and it was all a carefully built-up process, and there was Madeline sort of drifting off onto cloud 9. Well, fortunately, this impression didn't last long, because I soon met lots of other really down-to-earth, sensible astrologers too. So, but about intuition, one is often asked about it, and I do feel that we can align our intuition, going back to the doctor thing again, by saying that the sort of intuition we have to use is the sort of intuition a doctor has to use when he's coming to decisions about a diagnosis. Not the diagnosis itself, but deciding which area is strongest. And I think it's there that very often we have to feel that is the strongest area. Which planet shines brightest in the chart, I think, is a good way to put it. And that's where we have to come to decisions. And sometimes it's at that level, not just what you totally intuitively feel. You've got to have a good technique as well. Then we come to the sort of clinging client, the sort who rings you up far too often after you've given them several counselling sessions or something like that. Now, I feel that if this happens, it's up to us to look at ourselves again and to look at the chart and to ask ourselves whether we've really helped that person enough and whether we've helped them in a constructive way, whether we've got our points over clear enough. Because let's face it, the whole thing of astrology is to help strengthen our personalities, to help point out our strengths against our weaknesses, how to counter them, how to come to terms with ourselves. So if someone starts clinging, then take the blame on yourself. Say, I haven't done my job properly. Turn it back on yourself. And maybe you can help them to be more self-sufficient, more integrated, by going back over some work again. I think is quite important, is to avoid being pushed into saying more than you should. This can happen awfully easily in a counselling situation. Sometimes you get a client and you will explain something quite carefully and they will say, yes, but how? Yes, but what do you mean? Tell me what's going to help me. Tell me what I should do. But you must get that cut-out point. You must be very much aware of this. Not to be pushed over the edge, as it were, not to overcommit yourself. It's really quite tricky, that. And also, it seems too to be quite important that because we've all gone through various emotional problems experienced, because we've all lived lives, it is inevitable that we are going to identify with our clients' problems, and I think in a way that's good, providing we don't say, oh yes, you poor soul, and do you know, when I was 16 he said to me, and I said to him, you know, and you can get it into a sort of chatty, silly thing. I mean, for goodness sake, think yourself back. I mean, you can say, oh yes, I know exactly what that poor soul's going through, but for goodness sake, don't project it on them and get sort of involved in a sort of two-way sob story, if you like, because that really is really rather ghastly. A few practical tips. Keep and I'm sure most of you do this already, but do be very careful about keeping copies of all kinds of work, of letters from clients. Keep very full notes and keep drawings of your charts, because if you're just starting, you will soon find that you've got a lovely cluster of regular clients who come back time and time again over a period of time. Either they get married, they get divorced, they have children, or they open businesses, or they have grandchildren, and you get these wonderful, wonderful family files, and it's really very, very exciting indeed, because this builds up beautifully, and when you've been around a long time, you'll just realise that suddenly you've been doing work regularly for some about 18 or 20 years, and the files get this big. I do urge you to be very careful about this, partly because it saves work, and partly because if there's any comeback, then you know precisely how you stand. So be very, very careful about keeping neat files and records. You'll find your own system as you go on, whichever way you work. But it seems to me to be terribly important to do that. And coming down to the real nitty-gritty, the question of fees. Well, I always think that people, if you're working for someone at a distance and they can't come and see you, it's as well to get the fee in advance. Astrologers in the UK seem to fall into two groups. Either they don't have any trouble with clients who don't pay up, or they lose a lot of money. Now, Charles Harvey and myself have lost a fortune over the years. We really have. Ingrid Lynn and her lovely friends say, "Oh, no, everybody pays me. I've never lost a penny." Well, good luck. But we have found that we've had to be very, very firm about this, and we've had to say, because there are some clients who don't pay up, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you for the cheque in advance. And while, of course, you don't go right out and spend it on a crate of champagne, you're not necessarily paying the cheque to the bank until you're well into the work. But be careful about that, especially if you're beginning, because you think, oh, she's lovely, she's a jolly nice person, I should trust her. But in point of fact, you can lose a fortune, and it's jolly hard work, and I don't see why anyone should lose cash on this account. So do keep an eye on that. Work out your own system, but make a rule and stick to it. And honestly, while of course it's a good thing to always help people who are in trouble, but nevertheless, if you give a lot of work free, then people don't always appreciate it. Now, if you're a beginner, when you're a beginner, the words you hear most often in astrology is, "Oh, do mine, please, please do mine." How many times we've had that said to us? And okay, do mine, do anybody's you want, but get something like, say, a book token. Well, when I was learning, we used to, before these lovely great red ephemeras came along, we used to have to buy the little blue ones, the little Fulton's ephemeras, and we had to have one for every year. Well, this was a jolly expensive business. And what we used to do was to say, yes, I'll do yours if you buy the ephemeras for your year, you see. And that way they would pay about 10 shillings or something. That dates me. And they would buy their ephemeras, and that would be something as a bonus, because obviously you can't start charging big fees when you're just beginning. But get something out of them, even if it's a potted plant or a bottle of wine or something. Remember too that consultations and counselling is very, very demanding, and it's terribly important not to get too big a waiting list of clients, and it's equally important not to take too many in a day. Even if you get very well established and very busy, you must allow yourself time to restore, because otherwise you're not at your best, because we all know the work is so tremendously demanding. Also, I don't know if any of you are into biorhythms, but this is a good thing to watch too, especially if you're on your sensitivity criticals. You just have to work that much harder. So that might be something you could care to look out for. Well, that's thrown out a few tips. people often ask me how I got into astrology, and and I think everybody gets into it in a specific moment like that. And William Lilly, I believe, got into it at church, didn't he?
Yes. Yes, just sat next to someone in church who said, "Oh, I know someone who can draw up a chart," and took it to a terrible little drunken Welshman. Yes.
And we can all have an experience like that. Mine was, I wasn't in church, but Derek had been at Broadcasting House Library all day, and we were having dinner, and he said, "Hey, do you know," he said, "there's a Teach Yourself book on astrology." I said, "No, I must get that. I've always been interested in that." And that's how it happens. I think we'll end with perhaps Derek reading some good advice to all astrologers.
Well, it's something that you may know, but it's always worth hearing again. It's from William Lilly's Introduction to Astrology, and it's as true now as it was in the 1640s. "Beware of pride and self-conceit. Do not for shame deface thy nature, or make thyself unworthy of thy gifts. Learn all the ornaments of virtue, be sufficiently instructed therein, be humane, courteous, familiar to all, easy of access. Afflict not the miserable with terror of a harsh judgment. Be civil, sober, covet not an estate, give freely to the poor, both money and judgment. Let no worldly worth procure an erroneous judgment from thee, or such as may dishonour the art. Be not extravagant, or desirous to learn every science. Be faithful, tenacious, betray no one's secrets. Instruct all men to live well, be a good example thyself. Love thy own native country, be not dismayed if ill spoken of. And let the famous countries of Australia and New Zealand be ever blessed, and all their worthy citizens." Thank you very much.
Do you want questions, or is it going to...
Yes, please.
If you want questions, if they'll take questions, if you like.
I want to ask the question is, can Derek make an assignation with Vernon and get copies of William Lilly's advice to us so that we can take them away?
Yes, I don't see why. Well,
Yes.
I mean, I shouldn't do this, because you shouldn't make copies of books and get them free. So bookselling should know that.
William Lilly is out of copyright.
Oh, certainly. But interestingly, the Faculty of Astrological Studies in London was left some money by someone years ago to print that and give it free, a copy to each of its diploma holders, which is nice. But yes, I don't see why, if he doesn't mind.
Practically, maybe I could suggest that David, if you could let him have a copy of that, David could then take anyone who wants a copy. I don't think you need to do one for everyone.
Well, I've only got a very sort of random copy, but if there is at the bookstall a copy of the paperback of An Introduction to Astrology, William Lilly, it's certainly in there, and it'd be very easy to photocopy a page of that.
But if people refer to David, because you're going to be on the first thing
Yes,
tomorrow
yes,
morning,
okay.
so
Yes.
if you'd like a copy of that, see David Ingram, who's trying to organise it while you're
I'd like a copy. Thank you very much. Oh, this question of recompense, of people making their contribution to the astrologer, that really does seem to be a fundamental importance that they understand, doesn't it, right at the beginning, that it's a two-way contract.
I think so. I really do. Yes. And I think it's quite important. As I say, you can only do a sort of token thing when you start. Excuse me. Of course, if anyone's really distressed and flat broke, well, then it would be inhumane not to help. But there are an awful lot of people who will take advantage of you. And it's something you really should be on the lookout for. It sounds mean, but it is a professional attitude, and there should be some kind of two-way thing there.
Can you tell us about the training of the faculty at the moment?
Yes, it is 3 years, if you're lucky. The first year leads to an intermediate level examination. Then there is a further 2-year course, which is in 4 sections. And at the end of that, you take 4 examination papers covering astronomy, all aspects and techniques of astrology. There's a paper on harmonics and midpoints shared. there's a whole paper on calculations, and that has to be 100% correct. You have to draw a chart, progress it. And then there is an interpretation paper which you are given the case history on one Saturday, and you have to deliver to your invigilator the following Saturday a written report typed as you would present it to a client. And usually there is a full character analysis to write, and involvement with another person in that, some kind of problem, perhaps two other people. So that's a pretty daunting thing. And then if you pass all 4 papers, you can get a diploma. The examinations are independently marked by an examining board who have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the teaching. So it's completely divorced from that, and there is a very strict structure of rules how you take your exams, and you can either study anywhere in the world through the correspondence courses, or if you're in London or certain parts of the UK, you can go to classes, and there are extra seminars and things that you take along the way. So it is a very, very fine training, I think. So the exams are getting fiendishly difficult, and certainly the diplomas aren't handed out on a plate. If we have something like 32 candidates for the diploma level, well, I suppose if 8 get them, then they've done very well. And of those 8, if 4 get them for the first time, they sit all the papers, then that's splendid. Sometimes there are more, sometimes there are less. But
it's worth saying too, perhaps, that the subject chosen for the interpretation paper is usually chosen with a view to exposing any prejudice on the part of the astrologer, i.e. it will involve a black or a homosexual liaison or a wife beater or something which is likely to involve the emotions of the person sitting at the examination, in order to at least show to some extent the degree to which they might be tempted to allow, you know, their personal emotion to overcome their astrological judgment.
How much do they charge now for the course?
yes, I'm not entirely sure, but it is remarkably inexpensive for what it is. The fees obviously have had to go up, you know, since I was president, but it isn't terribly expensive. I think it's something like £50 a quarter for the, you know, each section. Not very much more anyway. Which, you know,
examiners get a fee for the correction.
Yes, they do. They get so much per paper.
Is that paid by the faculty or paid out of the
out of the examination fees. You pay to take the exam, you see, a few pounds, but it's subsidised because the fee that is charged the candidate for taking the exam wouldn't cover it. So that's taken.
Subsidised by the
Yes. It's quite a complicated structure.
And with regard to fees that astrologers charge in England, what is the high and low range?
Well, it varies enormously because so many of us have different expenses to cover. Obviously, if we're living in central London, it's you know, we have the highest, I suppose. There again, depending on the sort of work, would be. If I happen to like to write, it's the way I work. I'm a compulsive writer, so you know, this is just me. But of course, it is very time consuming. But I might perhaps charge £75 for a full written analysis and perhaps a set of progressions, or a full problem analysis with a set of progressions, followed up by counselling. And that, to produce the report is 4 days solid work. Well, when you consider that the lady who cleans my stairs in London takes 50 minutes and gets paid £5 for it, you know, it's not really very much.
Would consultations then be at a lower rate than a written report?
Not terribly much, I don't think, Doris. I think people will time themselves to the amount of time they put in their homework. And I think perhaps it might come out a little less expensive. I mean, for someone, say, at the same level as me, with about 3 or 4 counselling sessions, I don't think, say, Charles Harvey would be a lot less expensive than that, or
That
Christina
sounds
Rose.
extraordinarily cheap.
Yes, it is.
Yes,
It is.
for the amount
Yes.
of work.
The amount of work
It
involved.
is, yes, I know. We are fairly soft on our clients. Partly, I think, because we like to keep a lovely cross-section of clients. You know, it's so interesting to cope with different people of social backgrounds, of professions and age groups and everything, you know, whereas if one just goes to the top end of the market, well, all people are interesting. You only get maybe a certain type. And whereas if we keep our fees as reasonable as possible, we get more interesting people. Because in my own case, you know, I'm writing books and things as well, so the books do help to subsidise enormously.
At
So
the bottom end of the market, of course, the advertisements in the papers which say, send me £3 and I will send you the secret of the whole universe together with a free keyring. But I mean, that's not what you were talking about, really. I'm sure that happens here too.
No, from the point of view of
The consultant, yes.
when they first get their diplomas, for instance, and they first set out as consulting astrologers, their fees would not be as great as when they're
no.
5, 10, 15.
No, exactly, no.
So the lower range
Yes.
would be...
I
in
would
what
think
level?
30, 40 pounds, something like that.
Well, that's fairly much higher than here, I think,
Is
for
it?
the same.
Yes. Yes.
I think it would be very useful if it were possible, just as we were saying earlier about the possibility of getting a world standard of examination. It would be very useful, if at all possible, to get a general understanding about fees for various work. I don't see how it could be done with the various exchange rates and so on. It would be very complicated, but it would be very useful if we could possibly get agreement.
The medical profession have a range
Right.
of fees.
Yes.
The legal profession
Don't
have a
they?
range
Yeah.
of fees.
Yes.
And I think that astrologers should really, if we're going to classify ourselves as scientists,
Yeah.
then we would also have to have a stable rate of fees rather than charge the wealthy
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
a
right.
high rate, the
Yeah.
poor.
Yes.
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 So you would then need a sort of national astrological service as the National Health Service, wouldn't you, to cope with the people who couldn't afford anything?
Well, yes, that might be subsidised by some of these wealthy
Right,
organisations.
yes.
Well, in that respect, when you were talking about the niche for astrologers, there are astrologers, and I remember Gretchen Lauder, who worked for a very small fee at Cook Street Market with everyone who came on a very basic, direct way, and just as there are neighbourhood law officers and lawyers who work professions, there are astrologers who want to work in that area,
Yeah.
and should,
Absolutely.
and we should.
Well, I suppose we could have an astrologer's aid, like we have legal aid.
Why not? Yes, why not?
Sort of have a 1 day a week.
Yes,
where
yes,
could
a sort
be,
of, what do they call
Do we
it?
give our
a
Yes,
training ground,
Yes.
really.
yes, it would.
For the
Yes,
students coming in.
yes, that's marvellous.
The government repairs from the health budget.
Do I get the feeling that people are fidgeting a bit and wanting their coffee, or is there another one more question, or have you finished?
Are we selling ourselves short? If you were a really qualified doctor, you wouldn't say, hey, I'll only charge you $5 if I'm really qualified.
True. But perhaps they should. You know, William, Simon Foreman, when he was doing his medical astrology, used to charge £5, and if the patient didn't get better within a certain amount of time, he'd give £4 back. And I commend that to the medical profession. Well, thank you all very much indeed.